We are going to start with George Janes, who's an urban planner, and he's going to introduce the topic, and then we'll go on from there.
So, again, my name is George Janes. I'm an urban planner. I do a lot of technical work. I work a lot with the zoning resolution. And when this building was going up, I had nothing to do with this building. This is 433 Park Avenue. When this building was going up, it just kept getting, I was just so astounded because it kept getting taller and taller and taller. And I was like, I know zoning. Like, I know what you can do there, right? And I was like, you can't do that. I couldn't understand how this building was getting so tall. And so I took it upon myself to try to figure it out. I said, well, how is this building getting so tall? Most New York City iconic tall buildings, all of these that you see here right now, we couldn't build these today. They're too large. They're not allowed under zoning. They're all about what we call a 30 FAR building, which is the ratio of the size of the lot to the size of the building, right? And zoning doesn't allow any of these buildings to be built today. But this building, that's the Empire State Building in the background, that's much smaller. It towers over all of them. And I was like, what? So how did this happen? Did the zoning change? And in fact, we've done a lot of rezonings. You probably have heard about in the press. There's Hudson Yards, where we now allow buildings that could be up to 30 FAR in Hudson Yards. And East Midtown just passed, and we now allow buildings that could be very large in East Midtown as well, even larger than what we have today. But this building, the zoning has been that C53 zoning since 1961. Hasn't changed. The underlying zoning hasn't changed. There were some changes made in 1982. They weren't really all that major for the size of the building. So essentially, we had 2 generations for this building to happen in this location. The question of why are we seeing buildings like this now is actually a pretty simple one. So this is a graph that shows building height on one axis and building cost on the other axis. And the point of this is to talk about when you build a tall building, it gets more and more expensive to build as you go up, right? It scales non-linearly, as they say. So it's the taller you go, when you're building the 41st floor, it costs more than if you're building the 11th floor. But new technologies are changing this equation. They're bending the cost curve. It's cheaper now to build tall than it was just 10 years ago. One of my favorite lines that an architect told me earlier this year is that 50 is the new 30. 50 stories is the new 30 stories when it comes to cost. And then you have a market. Right now there's this market which is unbelievable, and it really supports higher revenues for higher floors. I remember like 15 years ago, it was all about the amount of square footage of your apartment. And now it's like all about your views, at least for the new ultra luxury market. And the difference between lowering costs and raising revenues is really the reason why you're seeing this, right? It's money. It's the fact that there is money to be made, and you have very, very creative people searching out how to make that money. The zoning, the rules that regulate the land in most places haven't changed so dramatically since 1961. So how are they getting so tall? And these are 3 examples here, and we'll go over some of the techniques. So we have these enormous mechanical spaces, structural voids, which I will talk about in a minute, stilts, and then we have crazy gerrymandered zoning lots. So remember I was talking about the ratio between the lot size and the building size? The bigger the lot, the bigger your building, essentially is the way it works. And so what you have, this is 200 Amsterdam on the west side, is you have people drawing these, the red line right there is the zoning lot, for 200 Amsterdam, which is the building up on the corner over there. It's spread out in this crazy gerrymandered way all over the block. And in fact, when the legal papers filed for this actually called it the gerrymandered lot. The lawyers that came up with this actually used the word gerrymandered. Anyway, and so you have all this area that's going onto that building, and that's why that building could be 660 feet. And then you have very generous Department of Buildings interpretations, which allow developers to do a lot of things that I think just 7 or 8 years ago would have been difficult. This is 88th. This is 188 East 88th Street, which Bonnie mentioned earlier, is enormous floor-to-floor height. So you now have buildings. Typically we have buildings that are 10-foot floor-to-floor, meaning from this floor to the floor above you. It's normally about 10 feet. Now you have buildings like this one is 16 feet floor-to-floor, and you have buildings that are even taller than that. So we talked about the ratio of the lot to the building. So that's the FAR, right? So you hear people talk about it a lot. It's called FAR, floor area ratio. It doesn't tell you how tall a building can be. It tells you how large it will be, how much space is in it. And so you have different density districts. You have a 4 FAR district, or a 10 FAR district, or a 15 FAR district. And essentially that governs what kind of building you can build there. But we're all talking about floor area. And the key point of what's really changing right now is that not all floor area counts. Developers have figured that one out. So what is floor area? It's where we are right now. It's habitable spaces, common hallways, interior walls are actually considered floor area. And that's non-zoning floor area. Things that don't count are things like accessory building mechanicals, your boiler room, your electrical closets, the plumbing chases, that electrical chases, and the chutes that go through your building, they don't count. Accessory parking, if you have a parking garage, it doesn't count. The cellars, they don't count. Some patios count, some patios don't. Some staircases count, some staircases don't. And one of my favorite is part of the exterior wall counts and the other part doesn't. It's a complicated set of rules, and in fact, this last one was done for really good reasons. Because one of the things that they say, or what architects say, is that they want to build greener buildings. They want to build buildings with a lot of insulation in their walls. But if they did that, that meant their walls were bigger. And if they did that, that means they have less space. And so what they said was, all right, so we're going to have a minimum amount of size for your exterior wall, but if you want to make it bigger, you don't have to count that against your space. And so there are good reasons for a lot of these things. We look at this and we think it's silly, but there were good reasons for a lot of these when they were implemented. But people are kind of gaming the system and figuring it out. So I'm going to talk about an example. This is in West Midtown, 217 West 57th Street. It's also called the Nordstrom Building. It is under construction right now. And the reason I like using it is because I've been following this a long time. In 2005, a long time ago now, I worked for their neighbor of the building. This building was just a plan then. And we were analyzing what this was going to do to the light of the Art Student League's artist studios. And we were doing lighting simulations for the Art Student League. So we needed to have the plan for the building at the time, in 2005. That time, it was 64 stories and 690 feet, which is a big building, but it's Midtown, right? Now, it was approved for 86 stories and 1,435 feet, which is similar to, but taller than, 432 Park Avenue. And in fact, it's going to be even bigger than that because they amended their plans after approval, and now it's 1550. But I only have the plans for the pre-amended version. So it averages 17 feet for each story. floor to floor. Remember I talked about floor to floor, so averaging 17 feet for each floor. But during that time it gained 22 stories, but nearly 750 feet. How did it do that? This is the building that's being built. It's color-coded according to use. Yellow is residential. This is part of the hotel. So this pink color is commercial uses. And the gray areas are all voids and mechanical spaces. The zoning floor area, the floor area that doesn't count, right? It's the floor area that doesn't count against the floor area ratio. So 27% of this building, or about 390 feet of its height, is space that doesn't count against its floor area ratio. That's an enormous amount. It used to be, we would think about, when we were doing development analyses like 10 or 15 years ago, we would have a 3 or 5% deduction. That's what we would do when we would do these things. We would say, well, you know, this will be a 5% because it's a commercial building, or a 3% because it's a residential building. But this is 27%. It's so far out of the standards that we used to do. One floor, right here, is 100-foot floor to floor. Which is a mechanical space, or really a platform to make the building taller. The apartments are actually a relatively reasonable 13 feet floor to floor, but the first 14 stories are 370 feet. And then they also have a bigger zoning lot, meaning like how large their zoning lot is to make the building larger. And this needs to be said, I think, because this doesn't get enough attention, is that these landmarks are all part of their zoning lot. So they sold their development rights so that they make a very tall Nordstrom building, and they got money to help preserve these landmarks. It needs to be, this absolutely needs to be acknowledged. These other buildings also sold their development rights. So these will likely never be redeveloped because they can't be built any bigger than what they are. It's like the only bodega in Midtown right there. Happy to see it stay. So you talk to architects very often. They'll say, so what? Tall buildings are cool. It's New York City, especially in Midtown. And zoning lot mergers, they preserve old New York, right? So if you have an old building and can sell its development rights, that helps preserve that building and helps it stay there. But one of the things that I note is that very often the voids are put at or near the street level. So this is on 30th Street in Madison. So what they did here is they have a lobby and commercial on the ground floor, and then they have an empty space that has some mechanical equipment in it that goes up to 155 feet. And so the reason they do this is all the other buildings on the zoning lot are 150 feet, or the tallest one is 150 feet. And so this way, they can have windows on all sides, and everybody has a view. There's no problems with blank walls. So everybody has a window. And you know, that's a bad place to put a void. You don't want the void near the street level, right? It's, you know, New York City, we all live here because there's a certain level of energy, right? And there's something that we really like about the energy of the city that really doesn't exist anywhere else. And you have these empty, lifeless spaces near the ground level. That's a bad thing. That's bad for urban design, is what we like to say. And it's also bad for these guys, who essentially are going to have to pass through large amounts of empty spaces to get to actual real people. Okay. Now, you could say Midtown is a special place, right? Midtown, we're going to have really tall buildings in Midtown. It's our Dubai or whatever, you know, that's an argument to be made. But, you know, the Upper West Side, the Upper East Side, we have certain protections in place, right? On the Upper East Side, which is where I live, we have certain rules. We can't have a 1,400-foot building on the Upper East Side. The zoning rules are such that you have to build a building that looks like this. This is called a tower on base. It's very, very determined. It has lots of rules. You have to have this big base on it. You can't have a very tiny tower. It has to be a relatively large tower, which means it ends up being shorter. You have to have a certain amount of your floor area under 150 feet in height. And so you actually see this pattern over and over again. All over the Upper East Side. You see a lot of buildings like this because you've had to build this building for like the last 25 years or so. But now we're seeing these tactics being used on tower on base, right? And so here you have a void. This is the 88th Street building again. You have a 34-foot void in the middle. It seems kind of modest, right, compared to what we've seen. It's only 34 feet of empty space in the middle of this building. It has the 16 feet floor-to-floor height. But what this building did that was really notable is it decided to cut off a portion of its zoning lot. So, heck you. I'm going to point out this little area right here. So, remember I was talking about how there needs to be a base, and this base needs to come to the street. Well, they said here, oh, we don't want our building to come to the street there. We'd rather have the floor area we'd have to put here up here. So what they did was they cut off a portion of the zoning lot. At first it was 4 feet. They said that, well, if we don't have that 4-foot portion of lot, we don't front the street. So if we don't front the street, we don't have to build a base there. And what they did, cleverly, this is the entrance to the building, right? So they wrote an access easement over this lot so that they could actually enter the building into it. Now, Carnegie Hill neighbors complained about this, and they ended up stopping work on this because the building department was like, gonna get serious. We're gonna stop work and make them fix this travesty. And several months later, they did, and they filed amended plans, and the 4-foot lot was expanded to 10 feet. And that made it legal. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but it's sometimes when you look at these things, it seems kind of funny. If 180 East 88th Street had been built with traditional tower on base assumptions, really, when I say traditional, it's meaning stuff we used to do a couple of years ago, it would look like this. Meaning 10-foot floor to floor, no funny business with the zoning lot, no void. It would look essentially like a 300-foot tower on the Upper East Side, of which there are many, many towers like that. Which, you know, that's the pattern we see up there, where you have the 300-foot tower, they buy the floor area from the neighboring building, so you have the tenements next to the towers. Instead, this one, same floor area, it's about 150 feet, 180 feet taller. So this one I love, because this is just approved in September. And so it's taken that whole concept of the void and took it to an extreme. So this is again the tower on base, where you have to have a certain amount of floor area under 150 feet. And so not coincidentally, this is exactly 150 feet, right? And so at 150 feet, they have a big empty space right here that goes up about 100 feet. And then they have a party room. This is an amenity room. And then they have another void over here. So this space from here to here is about 150 feet of empty space. And then you have 150 feet up here. So you end up with a building that's over 500 feet tall that has 25 usable stories. It has 83 units. Now there are some buildings that are going up right now. 520 Park, which I didn't include in here, that is taller than this, much taller than this, that has 41 stories and it has 41 units. And so we're building some enormous buildings, some absolutely enormous buildings with 1 unit per floor. This one seems generous in comparison. So anyways, let me, so what's up with super talls? So new technologies and market forces are effectively changing the bulk regulations. When I say bulk regulations, our zoning regulations. Our zoning regulations had produced something predictably for a long period of time, and now that's changing because of market forces and changing technologies. And you know, one of the things that's happening are these mechanical spaces being used as platforms. And then we have the large to enormous and huge floor-to-floor heights, counting the same as typical. So in New York City, you know, as I say, we measure things by how big, how much floor area you have. It's the same amount of floor area if you have 8 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet floor to floor, it's all the same amount of floor area, and we regulate it in the same way. And so if you just want a tall building, you have taller floor to floor heights. And then aided and abetted by the Department of Buildings, allowing things like shaping the zoning lots to avoid regulations. They have to approve these subdivisions, and they do. It used to be that the Department of Buildings would make you justify when you were taking in a mechanical exemption, and now they approve plans with spaces that say future mechanicals. That doesn't even currently have mechanicals. It's going to be holding future mechanicals, and it's exempt. And then there's the idea of, the Department of Building is very good at health and safety issues, right? They're on top of health and safety issues, and they take it very seriously. But things like privately owned public open spaces, like the little plazas that we have, qualifying open spaces, signs are regulated in zoning. They don't enforce that. I mean, there's really hardly any enforcement action on any of that stuff. And my belief is that if you're a scofflaw with one thing, you're often a scofflaw with other things. And so I think it makes it easier when you're ignoring a whole raft of your regulations that you're supposed to enforce to ignore others. And I think it's a cultural problem, and it's a problem that we need to fix. As a planner, I actually try not to take any positions on things like this. I am informing you of what's going on. But there is one thing that bothers me, is that these changes are just happening. Normally when we change zoning, there's a public process involved. We have to go through ULURP, which stands for the Uniform Land Use Review Process, all right? Which involves your community board, their hearings. You can come out and you can speak on this. And then ultimately it goes through the City Planning Commission and your elected official votes, right? So there's a process, and you get to influence that process. And I think that process could be better, but you know what? It's our process, and it's the one we have, and we should use it. And right now, all of this stuff is happening with none of the policy intention, no ULURP, no public input. It's just evolving and changing, which is a problem. It's a problem. All right, so possible solutions. Fixing mechanical spaces, like this right here is the low-hanging fruit, right? New York City, we're unique. No other jurisdiction treats mechanical spaces like we do. And in fact, the city itself tried to change the rules in 2000, 17 years ago, to limit the mechanical exemption, and they failed. The text amendments weren't passed. They were proposed under Giuliani and died under Bloomberg. And we already limit the mechanical exemptions in low-density districts, right? It's just in the high-density districts that we don't. A rational method of relating unreasonable floor-to-floor heights to zoning floor area penalties. So that means if you want to build a 20-foot cathedral ceiling, you can, sure, go ahead and do it, but you have to pay for it from your available floor area, right? So it counts half again as much, or twice as much, or whatever that number is. And then, working to make over the DOB in terms of, if you're claiming a mechanical exemption, it's got to be for mechanical uses, and it needs to be proportionally sized to the use that you're using it for, right? So you can't have a piece of equipment on the floor and have a 40-foot ceiling, right? That doesn't make sense. And in fact, one of these was challenged all the way to the Board of Standards and Appeals, which oversees the decisions that the DOB makes, and they actually wrote down that there is no limit. You can have as high floors as you want in mechanical spaces, 100 feet, 200 feet. They wrote that down, and that is now the way it works in New York City. The Department of Buildings, they interpret zoning. They don't write it. But when they interpret it, they don't go back and ask City Council or the Department of City Planning what they meant, right? I mean, there's no consultations. There's no, well, we think this means that. No, it doesn't mean that. It really means this. That doesn't happen. They just operate in a vacuum. So very often, when there's a zoning change, what happens is that you're told one thing. We are doing this for XYZ reason. And then when it gets to the Department of Buildings, they interpret it differently, and it's not being done. And ultimately, the reason that it was being implemented has essentially gone out the window because of who's interpreting the rules. So I started with this building, and I said, so how did this happen? And it's really not that complicated. There are 19 floors, full floors of mechanicals and voids out of 87 total in this building. They are a design feature. You see them lit up at night, right? These are all empty spaces. Nobody lives in these spaces. It's just designed for height. And also, they also use it, like any good architect, they use it for other purposes. This helps with the wind shear, right? The wind flows through these. And so it relieves some of the pressure. 23% of the gross floor area is in mechanicals, which are exempt from their floor area. And it uses a 16.5-foot average floor-to-floor height. I've been told that the very high floors here, they're only 13 feet within the apartment, but they need the extra 3 feet for very, very thick floors because the building is so tall. Okay, so one of the things that Bonnie wanted me to talk about is what you can do. If you think that policy needs to change, policy only changes when people get involved, right? If people don't ask for changes in rules, they do not happen. The politicians, the city planning commission, they will not care about it unless people ask. So you can ask individually. I think joining groups like Carnegie Hill Neighbors or Landmarks West or Friends of the Upper East Side, which supported my work on this, or any other conservation group in your neighborhood are really good things to do. I also encourage people to take small little actions, like you see something that's unsafe. If you dial 311, they will take a complaint and they will send out an inspector, especially if it's a health and safety issue. They will send out an inspector, and when they send out an inspector, you never know what the inspector is going to find. Maybe you found something there, or maybe the inspector will actually find something different. And they really can't do enough inspection on a lot of these sites. So even those little actions, they can result in some real changes. You know, stop works, or increasing safety. I know right now there is a stop work order on 180 East 88th Street because some of the workers were caught doing some things on their break they weren't supposed to be doing. That would affect their performance on the job. Which, that happens, but it's a construction site and it could be dangerous. And so, keeping your eyes out and doing little actions like that, I think are important. And I'm sure that Sean and Lo, who I see is here in the back from Carnegie Hill Neighbors, they'll be talking more about what you can do to get involved at an organizational level.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Sarah.
Yeah.
Every time I walk on 23rd Street, there's this enormous toothpick of a building. I don't even want to walk underneath it.
Yeah.
But can you explain something about new technology that's supposed to make these toothpicks safe?
Well, I know a lot. I'm not an engineer, all right? I have to say, so there's a lot about this I don't understand. But I know that buildings now are designed to sway, and they're designed to be flexible. And in the past, they were always designed to be rigid, right? And so you would have much more. You would need much more structure in the older rigid buildings. So you'd have a lot less. You'd have a lot more columns. You'd have a lot less usable space on the interior. Now buildings are allowed to sway a little bit more, and so that in fact they end up they could very well be safer than the older buildings. At least that's what I'm told. But again, I'm not the engineer. Secondhand. Kathy?
I don't want to disagree with you, but I'm going to have.
Okay, go ahead.
In terms of what we can do
Yeah.
if we join Landmarks West or the Municipal Law Society, because real estate interests own the city. This is something that our politicians who purport to be on the side of those who want to fight development, like Ben Callos and Gail Brewer, I think you all know that the development plan around Grand Central went through. So you're going to have 28,000 more workers on the 456 line. You're going to have the Long Island Railroad coming in to the 456 line. You have one Vanderbilt. No, I'm saying, what can you really do? The idea of our getting together with little groups when the real estate interests pay these politicians and own the city.
It's a fair point. Looking back, I look back at when the Tower on Base rules went into effect in the 1990s. That only happened because people came out. We look at contextual zoning that went into effect in the mid-'80s and has spread like wildfire all over Manhattan. That only happened because people like yourself demand it.
So again, to start, I'm Sean Khorsandi. I'm the Executive Director of Landmark West. We're in our 33rd year. We're your good government grassroots. We cover the Upper West Side, which is 59th Street to 110, scenic landmark to scenic landmark, so Riverside Park through Central Park. We have a large district. And this is a photo that we like to use to scare people, because it is scary. This is from Vanity Fair. This was an article accompanied by an article by Paul Goldberger, and it was about the shadows, and the shadows are getting longer, and there's more buildings since this was first published. And what we started identifying this is Billionaires Row. That's the creep of Billionaires Row. And we see 57th, 59th Street as a boundary line that's about to be breached. And that's why we're so on guard in our district. It's one thing to have these things in Midtown, in the central core. It's a very different thing to have things in residential neighborhoods like the Upper West Side. The Upper West Side is iconic. We have the Central Park West skyline, which is threatened, which we've been very protective of. And we've got a lot of institutions. In many ways, it's the cultural hub with Lincoln Center. We have, just to the north of our district, the intellectual hub with Columbia. And it's mainly residential. So in that case, many people find it as a sleepy district, but it's far from it. People think that the Upper West Side is built out. It's simply not true. In the foreground here, we see the view north from Lincoln Square. On the base here in red, we're seeing the expansion of the Fordham Superblock campus. So just north of this in the photo is Lincoln Center. This is all part of the Lincoln Square urban renewal area. And what Fordham got to do in a pact, they haven't built the buildings on the right yet, they were able as a nonprofit to develop 2 of 8 new buildings and flip them to a developer. So they sold these sites. This is a 54-story building, and this is a for-profit luxury residential building that's then going to subsidize and pay for the rest of the buildings that they're doing on this site. Their long-term plans also include closing 62nd Street between Fordham and Lincoln Center because now they've built out all of their space and there's no more open space. So we'll effectively have a block from the Apostles' Church almost till Juilliard without traffic if they get their way. Just further north of this, you see the super talls. And so a little caveat on super talls. I know that's part of the name of tonight's talk. We consider a super tall anything that's out of scale with its context or its neighbors. So if you're in suburban Queens, that might be a 6-story building if you have a 3-story house. But it's something that's grossly inappropriate or out of scale with the context. So the 2 buildings we're looking at here are 200 Amsterdam on the left, which is the gerrymandered lot that George had just shown, and on the right, a development on 66th Street. I'm going to touch on both of these today. And I'm going to talk, George talked a lot about how these happen. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the factors in play that allow these to happen, specifically the community facility bonus, which seems to be a common thread for development sites in the Upper West Side. Common to these also, there's further development in Riverside South. There's the Collegiate School, and we're getting our own other glassy towers in Waterline Square. You might have heard about this in the news recently, where a construction worker killed his boss at point blank range. That was here. So this was Rafael Mineo, KPF, and Vignoli of 432 Park Avenue fame. So we're getting them in our district as well. So this is just at the southern tip on the far west side. So looking into what future development was going to be, we engaged Weiss and Yost 10 years ago in 2007. And everything that you see in red is there standing poised potentially as a soft site to interrupt our Central Park West skyline. The problem with this, though, is this was done in 2017. And as George identified pre-2012, all these numbers are wrong because they're about 60% below what they should be. All of these were figured again on that 10-foot floor-to-floor height, which is now averaging over 16 feet. So this is grossly out of scale. This was also only considering a certain distance offset from Central Park West to the west. So what we're finding already are intrusions that are beyond that scope of inspection. So we start on West 66th Street. This was a site that we've been looking at and hearing about, and these slides are a little out of date. We have a little bit more information on them, but I'm going to share this to give you a general picture of what was going on. We have a cleared site. Right now, this is 55 Central Park West. This is the Ghostbusters building. There's two other residences just west of those. On this site stood three set buildings. This is where ABC's daytime soaps used to store their props. Just immediately to the right of that was the congregation Homonym. Then there was a parking easement. There was a driveway for the Jewish Guild of the Blind on the south side of the block. And just further west of that is an individual landmark. That's the First Battery Armory, which is now the New York City headquarters for ESPN. Since it's an individual landmark, it has a hard time expanding. It would need approval from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So one of the good things that the Landmarks Preservation Commission does is allow landmarks, individual landmarks, to relieve themselves of their air rights in order, in theory, to sustain the landmark itself. Often that's not the case, but in theory that was the spirit of the law when it was written. So two different developers, Megalith Urban Park and Xtel Development of 157 and the Nordstrom Tower fame, came together, bought these units separately, and are combining them. When we looked at this originally, we thought that this blank site in the foreground here is Capital Cities ABC's headquarters and other residential buildings. We saw that this site actually fronted onto a different district to the south, which is the Jewish Guild for the Blind, another neighborhood nonprofit. We found through Attorney General filings that the developer is also in talks to buy this building, and we just got confirmation from the neighbors yesterday that they are in fact currently demolishing the building. This is not part of the story though. When we looked at this site, we first envisioned what they could do as of right, and we figured our graphics are not nearly as good as George's. I apologize. Initially it would be a 70-story building, which is head and shoulders above everything else. Literally the second tallest building is almost half the size at 36 stories. But then we realized with other bonuses, they could get 84. Since then, we've spoken to the city council representative in the district, and she has confirmed through her lobbyists that the developer wants 80 to 100. So we're still looking at that, but part of the reason that I wanted to point out this, and it's maybe a small part of the pie, is the community facility bonus. So the community facility bonuses came with FAR, as George just explained, in 1961 zoning, and these allowed for certain uses like child daycare and medical facilities, and the idea was this alleviated some of the pressure on hospitals, but it also brought these uses into the communities where maybe they wouldn't be served. It makes sense in certain residential districts, but not in all. And we're finding more and more, this definition has been expanded. You'll see a lot of areas in the village. NYU uses this for a lot of dorm uses. These don't have to be assigned. There's not a rent set with them. When we talked to George earlier, he had mentioned certain FAR that needed to be below this 150-foot height limit. Well, you can put the really tight 8-foot ceilings in these areas, say it's a community facility use, and then never rent it. You could put it beyond market rate, so it's out of reach for nonprofits. There's no citywide listing for these. There's really no governance of these. So it's just another way to build a podium, pack your FAR, and then you can expand above that. So when you look at the building, this is what they've filed. Xtel, famous for 157, as I mentioned, in the Central Park Tower, is looking at a 25-story building. Why would you buy so many air rights for so many millions of dollars from neighboring buildings, assemble sites, and build a 25-story building? Stone's throw from Central Park. The best part is on their construction fence they have this rendering. This is not the building next to it. This is not the building next to that. There are no fancy trees such as this, and the best part is the reflection is not what's across the street. The ABC buildings would be coming to here, so we're already set back in some plaza that doesn't exist. And this is A-okay. We've spoken to, the other comment we've talked about is that there's a bit of a revolving door between city agencies and these developers. And through our discussions with them, they've said, well, we filed for this. I said, yes, but what will it be? Well, you know, what's filed isn't always what's built. So they can make a plan amendment. What we're looking at in this case is, what's that tipping point when it's a new building? Is it when a 25-story building becomes 30? Is it when it becomes 80? And what's the limit? There's no rules for this. We're in uncharted territory. So this is a rendering we found on the internet, looking from Lincoln Center back to it. When we look at this, that's 25 stories. If we're talking 80 to 100, it would literally be off the slide. It would be beyond the top if you continue at that scale. And this is the Upper West Side. So just looking at this idea, I'm going to get to how that happened in a moment. We have other development in the Upper West Side. The American Bible Society is a nonprofit that's been around for 148 years in New York until 2014 when it sold and moved to Philadelphia. It had a perfectly great 12-story building by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, a signature firm. It had an FX Fowl expansion in the front, the swale for the Museum of the Bible. And inside they had an Annabelle Seldorf interior, all top shelf architects. Now they're planning a 34-story building that's over 400 feet tall, so it can be an overlook building, a periscope basically, and look over 15 Central Park West and get views of the park. This is SOM cannibalizing its own project, and this is one of 3 that Skidmore, Owings & Merrill is doing in the city as we speak. So this is how the building's working out, and then the view from the west, looking east. So just a sense of, here's a nonprofit that has had 148 years of tax-free existence that cashed out. And this was sold at $300 million. So when we were in undergrad, which was longer and longer ago, but not so long ago, the idea was if you were planning out a project, you were looking at a hospital, you were figuring it at about $500 a square foot. That was a lot. You know, normal office to 200, 220. This was sold for $1,000 per future buildable foot. That's before they've changed the locks, torn down the building, drawn a line in AutoCAD, filed a permit, anything. There's so much money to be made from these from the high-up penthouse apartments. So we have development. The Upper West Side started as the Harsden Estate and largely farmland. This worked on speculation. We have wonderful rows of row houses, our iconic streetscapes, the mid-blocks, the R8B, contextually zoned blocks right now. We're largely built on speculation, just as, in many ways, the American Bible Society, but a little bit different. Then came the mid-century. The Upper West Side suffered a lot under urban renewal. There was a sense that clearing land would cleanse the city, make it more sanitized in a way that people who are fleeing to suburbia would choose to stay. It would be safer. We would create all the suburban amenities with parking and open space and light that everybody was fleeing for, but you could still be in the city. And in effect, we ripped apart neighborhoods. We displaced people. We displaced the largest African-American community in New York City from the 1940s up until it was displaced. This was the hub of jazz in New York. And largely, these are Con Ed towers on where Juilliard currently is. This was the hub all the way to the rail line, and this has all been covered over since.
Thelonious Monk.
Thelonious Monk was displaced from here and moved into Lincoln Towers after this. So this is the federal bulldozer, and we all paid for it. We subsidized it. This was Robert Moses' grand vision to create a cultural hub, another anchor for the community, and we have great signs here. You don't tear down homes in a housing shortage. There was a lot of political posturing at play, but Rockefeller had decided this is going to be Lincoln Center, and then it continued to move forward. The problem is they never replaced the housing that they took away, and anybody who was displaced in their networks was dispersed. They were just meant to leave, and now we didn't have to worry about it. So we removed a big core of affordable housing. As many people know, the West Side Story, they actually held off the demolition for a week to 10 days so they could film in the empty streets before they bulldozed the rest of it.
Oh, really?
So this is what we're talking about. This is the Sharks and the Jets. The Upper West Side has planning safeguards, though, so we shouldn't have all these problems. We have historic districts. If you look at your map, which is hot off the presses, we actually even have picked up 12 buildings to the far right in the Morningside Heights Historic District. Of our stats, we have almost 70% of the buildings of the Upper West Side by building count protected. So you'll see large swaths of vacancies. Lincoln Towers area, or further to the north, the Park West Village area. These were part of the urban renewal clearing areas where they tore out all of the fabric. So there is nothing to save, but this is also partly what is coming of age maybe to be considered or evaluated, and it's losing that opportunity because we're creating intrusions. In all, the Upper West Side is 3 scenic, 57 individual, 4 interior, and between our 12 historic districts and historic district segments, 3,261 other landmarks. We're well protected. We've done our job. We also have contextual zoning. So any zoning district with an A or a B suffix has a height limit. Part of the problem is, though, that the city has recently changed what those limits are. We also have this blue area, which is where the 66th Street project is, which is the Lincoln Square Special Zoning District, where additional bulk can take place. What's interesting, though, is these relate pretty closely to your maps. So a lot of the protected areas physically are also protected through zoning. Despite that, there's still some intrusions, and then there's areas for bigger change. And these happen in part because of zoning for quality and affordability, which is an initiative passed by our past and future mayor and his city council, past and future, which allowed zoning for quality and affordability. I know it's small, but in all these dark brown areas, it's saying on a narrow street you get to build 20 foot higher. So if the whole idea is you have a cornice line and you're building to a certain set standard with your neighbors in context, and suddenly we're changing that context by 2 stories, it's not really contextual anymore. So in addition to all these protections, there's gaps. The heart of the Upper West Side is arguably 79th and Broadway, and here we have the confluence of 4 different historic districts. Despite that, smack dab in the center is Zabar's, which has no protections. It's been in every film and movie, an NBC sitcom on Thursday night, but it could be torn down if the owner so chose, at their behest. Similarly, we have the 1914 department store, which has our very own Banksy, New York's only, as far as I'm aware. So these are all both cultural icons, but they're not protected. Immediately adjacent to all of these are development pressures. And all of these are actually currently in the works. This beautiful eyesore, this building, which is this is still standing, which could be even taller with ZQA. And similarly, this building, which has since been cleared, could already become much taller if it was torn down, but even taller now with the benefit of zoning for quality and affordability. So we look at this whole segment of Broadway, and why hasn't it fully been protected? It's a growth corridor for the city. In 2010, we were looking at a historic district extension, and most of it went to the Broadway edge. And you'll see the only buildings now that go to the Broadway edge are the ones that go through to West End Avenue. We called it the de Blasio diet at the time, because he pulled every building back. And then we started mapping any building that's less than existing half FAR, and that was before MIH and ZQA. So there's a lot of soft sites that are ripe for development, all along just the Broadway corridor. Why did we get the contextual zoning? In part, we fought for it because of Gary Barnett, Extel Development. Ariel East and West just rose, seemingly out of nowhere. They stick up. We've fought and protected the surrounding zoning, so now we've also protected his investment and the views of those residents. But you'll notice those 2 pink spots. Almost everything else on that block is blue. So those are all individual landmarks. They sold their air rights and he merged them. This is St. Michael's Church, which is just landmarked as part of the backlog, the Midtown Metro Theater, and the Ukrainian Library. All of those sold, that's the Metro in the foreground on the right, to create these buildings through transfer of development rights. And this is something that a lot of nonprofits like to do. Why do we not protect more nonprofits? This is a case in point. The Landmarks Commission designated this the Mount Nebo Synagogue. It was more recently than Mount Nebo. It was built as the Unity Temple, and this is where the Seventh Adventists were before they sold the building to a developer in 1981. It was designated in 82 and undesignated in 84. The developer, not a nonprofit, claimed hardship. Well, it's hard for me to deal with this building on this site. So there's a 6-page designation report and then a 1-page, yeah, never mind. We no longer find it significant. So this building, which had this great interior, is now this. But we get this nice little V in the middle. The developer got their money, the community lost out. And that was a case similar that we're seeing played out elsewhere. Landmarks Preservation Commission is supposed to designate based on architectural merit, cultural significance. This synagogue has been around for a century. The synagogue congregation is dwindling, and they've chosen to sell themselves to a developer. So after a century of being on the Upper West Side in this site, they get to take their building, tear it down, and could build, as of right, a residential building on that site, but with the community facility bonus, build even higher. So as a result, the neighbors get a building that's even taller than residential zoning because they have the added benefit of having this on site. This is the best rendering we could get of what's planned for the site. So it's a further burden on neighbors. And in most cases, it's a boon for the congregation. Time and again, we're here about a spiritual purpose. We're not here to protect bricks and mortar. And this allows us to continue our faith-based activities. Oftentimes, the developer gets to build a community facility out to the rear lot line on the first floor, sometimes on the second, depending on the zoning district, and give away cellar space. So for what's a really cheap land deal, a lot of developers do this. And Congregation Shari Zedek, which is about 40 families, from what I understand, will own this until the C of O is complete and then immediately transfer rights to the developer. Similarly, it was Congregation Homonym that agreed to a similar deal that's allowing for the tower on 66th Street. Congregation Homonym has been here since '58, and it's in a land swap. Right now they're being housed elsewhere. The developer has given them temporary quarters and will shoehorn them back in, but as a result that adds to the buildable FAR that they get. And as we know, the FAR at the base just allows the upper apartments to have better views, so developers are keen on this, and they get the land at a reduced rate as a result. Similarly, I call this the Cookie Jar Synagogue. The Lincoln Square Synagogue did a land swap. And the building that's here, 200 Amsterdam, this is from the gerrymandered lot, is in an R8 district. So the building just to the right of that is 17 stories. That is really how tall this should be, theoretically. It's not a tower district, but that is very much a tower, I think. The Lincoln Square Synagogue moved down the block to 2 lots. This is their new home. And this is the gerrymandered lot. It's not yellow like George's was. I should have made it yellow. And this is all on the periphery of Lincoln Towers. This was a super block site. The city granted streets and sidewalks and merged several blocks up to 70th Street. And the idea was this was a planned unit. It was master planned. It was set. There were not supposed to be additional towers, let alone towers twice the height of the context. And this is the building as proposed, which we're in the process of fighting.
This is right in front of Lincoln Towers?
This is right in front of Lincoln Towers. This is the Rite Aid, right on the corner. That's 70th Street just out of view. This is Amsterdam. 69th Street actually T-bones the site right about here if it was to be a through street. So they're marketing this building, which is 3 avenues from Central Park with Central Park views. It's actually closer to Riverside Park. The best part about this, and this is a great photo, George didn't get into too much detail about this, but the backyard that's being counted is actually parking that is owned and assigned to units in Lincoln Towers. So the rear lot that they're qualifying their site for is actually owned by someone else. And so this is the building on the far right, that glass tower in this image. And part of the other factor is outdated zoning, right? We just have this simple sense that we can move unused air rights from one landmark or property to the next. And this is a case time and again that we saw at Homonym, we saw it at Lincoln Square, and we're also seeing a potential for it on 96th Street. This is the slowest demolition site in New York City. This is on the north side, of 96th Street. Everything on the south side is protected. The south side has contextual zoning, the north side doesn't. These 3 row houses would have been protected if they were on the south side of the street. Instead they were on the north. They're being torn down right now, but they're also adjacent to another potential site. So this is now, through Slice Architects, the proposal for the site, which is not wretched by the standards we've seen, but it's still much taller than the context. But we looked at what would happen if the site right now is just out of view behind this tree. Google Earth couldn't chop it down for us. If you take, in the foreground, the former First Church of Christ Scientist, which is an individual landmark and has a lot more zoning air rights available because it's on Central Park West as a larger scaled avenue, and did a zoning lot merger with the building behind it, they could transfer their air through the building. And all they would have to do is sign an agreement. It doesn't really affect the building behind it in any sense. They're not losing they're actually in fact guaranteeing their park views if they get the bulk removed from them. They move it to the west, and then we looked at what that could be, and it's insane. It's over 50 stories. And this is completely legal. And this is with not so egregious standards. This is our standard base height, and then anything from that, really, literally the sky is the limit. These could all stretch to be 20-foot floors, whatever your heart desires. So other soft sites that we're concerned with, it's basically the religious properties. I printed out a list of every religious property that's a sanctuary, temple, place of worship on the Upper West Side. About half of them have protections because they're in historic districts. The other half do not. This is St. Gregory the Great, Roman Catholic Church. It was a They call it the typology was a skyscraper church because the church was embedded in the body of the building. It's actually on the second floor. This was on the closure list and in fact just closed. It's not protected. Similarly, we've got word that Central Baptist Church already has an architect and a condo plan for the site. Similarly, but there are good sites. This one is in the district and it is protected, so that the congregation here was on hardship times, but they were able to split the baby. So while they kept the building from the street, the church functions are now in magenta, and they're selling off the upper floors as residential. So they were able to split it. So that's maybe a good example. Hope is not all lost. Unfortunately, though, we have other congregations. This one is right at the corner around our office, Congregation Shareth Israel, which tore down its community facility, which was a partial school, partial office in that lot you see in the back. This is the oldest congregation in the country. And they were seeking to build a community facility that should only be as high as this line. And they're doing it, basically the top 5 floors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are all residences, and they say they need this to pay for the building. So the city is giving them 2.5 floors free, and basically effectively 5 that are not for their use, other than the use of financing the facility beneath. So this is some loopholes of the city, even when there's contextual zoning in place, even when there's landmarks preservation oversight, everybody bends the rules because people don't want to tread too heavily on the religious properties or the community facility use. So those are some examples. I know I'm over my time. We can talk more about them.
The Department of Buildings, is that, who controls that? They're obviously unelected, and what's the structure of that, and how can we influence them?
Rick Chandler's in charge of that. Who controls them? It's a mayoral agency, but I'd like to just cite our BSA hearing where we had an engineer talk about the mechanical voids for 15 East 30th Street. And she said that she introduced herself. I used to work for the DOB, then I went to the private sector, then I worked for the DOB, and now I'm in the private sector. And let me tell you, we don't even do areas for mechanicals, we just count mechanical floors. Like, nobody can be bothered. She was just saying this is how it's done. So she, from the private sector, was telling the BSA how they operate. And this is where the revolving door situation or the tail wagging the dog comes into play, like who's in charge. And it comes into a team of, a developer sets up a team of specialists and lawyers who just stand up, locked arms in line, and say, challenge us, prove it in the law. And it's the community who has to get together, raise the funds, and fight it. And it's now become a legal battle no matter what.
Yeah, but how do we hold them accountable?
You go to the hearings, you call them out at the BSA, you do things like join George at the BSA. So when 15 East 30th Street came up, George made calls to our agencies, our neighboring organizations. MAS was there, Friends of the Upper East Side was there, Landmark West was there, and this was on the east side. But we all know that if it can happen there, it can happen in our district. And we're New Yorkers, so this is all of our city. So we're doing our best to lock arms and fight as the offense, but it's fledgling.
The DOB is accountable to the mayor. It's part of the administration. So he appoints the commissioner, who's the boss, but this commissioner is a holdover from Bloomberg. So he was appointed. Yeah, he was appointed by Bloomberg.
How do we get them out?
It's politics, and I leave that to Sean and Mo.
But does the mayor appoint all of the members of the BSA?
Yes.
Yes. So he's entirely belongs to the current mayor that's...
There are terms, and so yes, so some are holdovers from previous, but they serve their term, and then when their term is up, they get to appoint a new one on the commissions. The commissioners, they have the option to replace.
So we have to go on to Lo. This is Lo Vandervalk. He's with Carnegie Hill Neighbors, and he's been doing an amazing job on landmarking of the Upper East Side and fighting these buildings that are going on up there.
My name is Lo Vandervalk. I'm president of Carnegie Hill Neighbors. Carnegie Hill is, our catchment area is 5th Avenue to 3rd Avenue, though not including 3rd, and 86th, louder, 86th Street to 98th Street. on the Upper East Side. However, we do get involved in issues that are outside of us when we think they do impact on our area. Let me begin with, this is a tower that is under construction at 3rd Avenue and 88th Street. We're looking at it from 87th Street. It's going to be more than 500 feet. Is it 550, somewhere in there? George has already shown you this building because it has many voids. You can see them clearly, certainly in the middle. And it also has, voids are sort of empty mechanical spaces. And it has very tall floors, especially at the higher floors. It's an L-shaped lot. So that's 3rd Avenue, and it also fronts on 88th Street. We have worked with George and a lawyer complaining to the buildings department that this is really an illegal permit. The building is being built on an illegal permit, and the reason for that is you see that tiny little blue strip along 88th Street. That is 10 feet, that is now currently 10 feet, it used to be 4 feet wide and 22 feet across along 88th Street. They segmented that and sold it to themselves through an LLC company, but clearly they don't deny that they really ultimately own it. And because of that, they claimed to the buildings department that they do not front 88th Street, so they're not required to build a tower on a base. And the base would be roughly 60 feet high. That would observe the continuous street wall, which is what zoning was revised when it was recognized that those bonus parks weren't working out too well. Our contention is that lot belongs to the entire lot, and therefore it fronts on 88th Street, and it took us months and months and months before the buildings department would issue a definitive written statement of their opinion. So just getting their opinion is sometimes tough. In the meantime, the developers felt comfortable to go ahead. There had been a stop work order. Ben Kalos of the Community Board and Gail Brewer, Manhattan Borough President, did step in very early. That was already in May 2016. So where are we now? We're now faced with going to the BSA. We know that will take a long time, and we are considering simultaneously to pursue a lawsuit. We have teamed up with Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District.
We're going to share legal expenses, but it's still very expensive. And everybody says, you're going to lose this.
But you know,
there's the fog of war. The fog of war, is something where neither side is sure what the other side is doing. You don't know what can happen, and therefore you have to try. We've already said, should we lose this, we will still develop a paper trail with which we can approach the City Planning Commission and argue that there should be a change in the zoning law, called a text amendment, so that this can't happen.
Regardless of who owns the tiny little lot, I think it's a functional thing. No matter if it's owned by a Hong Kong company, but if you are using the lot for your safety egress and for your main entry, then functionally, and I hope our lawyers will use this argument, functionally it is the same lot. And so that's the kind of writing we want to see in the zoning law. So we're playing several games at the same time. And the reason why we are also going to court is that the BSA takes too long. And next slide, please.
What is the BSA?
Board of Standards and Appeals, which is where that's the final city agency where you can review things that deal with the buildings department. It is also the city agency that schools go to when they want to exceed zoning limits. They get variances from the BSA, but you have to go through the process, and everybody gets to participate. And it can work. It can work marginally well because you get to dialogue and you at least are able to articulate. Although the cards are stacked against us. But as we see now, schools are not the major violators anymore. Now it's become the churches, and so it's developed. But behind it is it's developers. Schools traditionally weren't developing their property for private development. They needed it for educational space. So I want to put in a good word for schools because because we need schools. And even though we generally do fight them, but we fight fair and we ask them to make modifications. And I think in our communities worked out well with one exception. Dalton was allowed to go to 180 feet in the mid-block where zoning requires that you go no higher than 75. They had already gotten earlier variances and we thought this was over the top, okay? And that's not far from here. That's 89th Street, this is 88th, 89th between Park and Lex. This is between Lex and 3rd. Okay, so you see, the construction is going on, so our complaint may be moot. So that's why we're going to seek an injunction at the court level and then see how far we can take this. Now we're going to turn to a really interesting case. The Marx Brothers Playground at 96th Street and 2nd Avenue and the Co-op Tech Vocational School at 96th and 1st Avenue. Together they occupy the entire block. And this is an educational project where they're going to build a tower. Next slide, please. That's the tower, the residential tower that will fund the 2 high schools and a new vocational school. So this is an illustration of your elected government. I mean, remember when that tall building went up at Park Avenue, 432 Park? People would come up to me, why didn't you guys do something about that building? I said, it's as of right, we can't touch it. This is not as of right, and this is the government doing it. So now the government's gotten into the act because the government owns properties in the cities. They own schools and they own parks. They own parks. They own Central Park. I'm not touching that one yet. Not yet. Been many attempts. But there are other parks, and now we're going to see. Okay, next slide, please. So half of this block is the Marx Brothers Playground. That's a park. The other half on 2nd Avenue towards the river is the vocational school. It's only a 3-story structure, and it's very spread out. So there's plenty of development that could be done. So this lot was zoned in 2 halves. One was a sort of lower density R7-2, and the other was R9. R9 has height limits. And so the first thing, this is part of a whole ULURP process. That's what we call Uniform Land Use Review process. And this is an illustration where sometimes that process, the deck is stacked against you, and that was the case here. And the reason for this is that this falls in the council district of Melissa Mark Viverito, who is the speaker still, and there is the tradition of deference to your city council member, even though 96th Street is a dividing line between Ben Kalo's district and Viverito's district. But this hands-off approach, even though shadows will be cast on another district, you can't find any assistance from the other council members, except informal condolences, maybe. So the playground, they wanted the playground to be moved. The tower will come here. The vocational school is up there. And the 2 high schools will be in the blue area on 2nd Avenue. Oh, great. So next slide, please. Okay, so here's the tower. It will be 700 feet high, 63 stories. Manhattan Borough President got 5 stories knocked off. So she won 50 feet for us. Small things matter. And these are the 2 high schools. And this is the vocational school, and this is the playground now that would be moved. In the ULURP process, I was one of the few people who spoke out at Community Board 11. There was one other person, I think. You knew you were going to lose. And there were many meetings at the Community Board, so I attended a number of those and spoke out. They were engaged with the carrots, the high schools, the jobs, and so forth. So you couldn't talk about, nobody there cared about tall buildings, even though Harlem has taken the mayor to task for allowing rezoning that would allow taller buildings, and this would be much taller than most of what's rezoning in Harlem. But it was so far away, it's sort of sequestered in a corner that no one cared. But we thought it was important to fight this still. So it went through the city planning City Planning Commission did and that's a very good process because you submit written testimony, it goes into the formal file, and the questions that you ask have to be answered, and you learn more information. So you're sort of getting more information, but you're not going to get a favorable decision. The decision was against us. Then it went to the City Council, committee level, and then the full council vote. You never know quite when the full council vote occurs. But as far as we're aware, it was opposed by no one. Here's the saving grace. Maybe dating back to the traditions of Tammany Hall and that the state could never fully trust the city. And that applies to parks. You cannot alienate a park or move it without state approval. And so the state is the adult in the room. But don't count on it. It flew through the Assembly. It flew through the Senate. We had Liz Kruger, the sole opposing vote in the Senate. We had some support in the Assembly. Rebecca Seawright was a leader to oppose on our side. Okay, so then it had to go to the governor, and that's where we waged our campaign. We had letter writing campaign. We got the great organizations of this city, Municipal Art Society, finally woke up to the threat to parks. Because there was no guarantee that if anything should go wrong, that park would truly be replaced. They used the same language that was used for a sliver of the park that was a staging area for the 2nd Avenue subway. And that language is also always very vague so that no one, you can't lose your shirt in case something goes wrong. I mean, suppose the developer went bankrupt and the banks went after that park and wanted to use that park for development. I'm painting in outrageous scenarios, but it's the outrageous scenarios that
That's why I'm saying it's not outrageous.
Yeah, that can occur. And as a matter of fact, Carol Maloney's chief of staff said, Lo, you can't discount for anything. If it's not written down, you don't have it. It was too lax. But there was the other issue. This is a park that's called a JOP, jointly operated playground. Playgrounds in the zoning law are parks, okay? So that's how we can claim it's a park. Parks are protected in the zoning. You can't build on a park. Parks have no air rights. So by alienating it, they would suddenly get the air rights and they were able to build something twice as tall as they otherwise could. That's the plan. But the governor has all these bills, about 600 bills a year, and then he calls up 100 at a time. And we heard when it was being called up and it was going to be decided. Then he's got 10 days to decide. And the last day was October the 23rd. Yeah. Frank was there. We were in front of his office, still lobbying. We had a letter from the Trust for Public Lands and the Municipal Art Society. So and all sorts of letters, and we knew that the governor was starting to pay attention. He made a fantastically brilliant decision. He said, "I'm signing the bill, but I will not allow any parkland to be alienated if it can be shown that these JOPs, or this particular, if it can be proven that this is a park, because there were two sides to that issue, then I will not allow this to happen." So that was the pledge he gave. And he said, who's going to decide? I'm appointing the Parks Commissioner of Parks and Recreation, the State Commissioner, to decide. I'm not giving it to the Parks Department of the city. So he kept it under his control, and there's no deadline. He's promised no deadline, and I think both sides are going to be allowed to lobby and advance their cause. What's interesting about this park, however, is that it was built roughly at the same time as the vocational school, but the vocational school never really used it. I mean, if you go back, I always say, look in their yearbooks. Is there a football team? Was there any relation between these? Apparently not. So we think we have very strong grounds. And the reason that they were developed at the same time was logical, because it was a staging area for buses and subways, or it was public land that was going to be reused, and that's why this happened. So shortly after World War II, in the early mid-40s, 47, 48. So finally, I want to say is you can't give up. You got to try. You got to stay in the fight, and you got to raise money. But also you need letters. You need letters of support. I have some letters because Bonnie asked me. So if you can still belatedly sign a letter, and we'll send it to the governor. I mean, So I'm gonna, you can see how we did the letter and
So if you sign them and leave it at the desk on your way out, okay?
that's the end of my talk.
All right, good. Good, thank you.
Okay.
Any questions?
Yeah.
I'm just following this case because I have interest in it, over the ECF's role, and you know what I'm
Yes.
talking about. Because they're doing the same thing in Brooklyn that we're fighting at
Indeed.
80 Flatbush Avenue. So I thought they had alienated, I had heard they alienated the parkland, or maybe did they just vote
The
it?
city approved that the parkland, it's called the home rule. The city approved that the park could be alienated, but the ultimate alienation decision rests with the state.
But the Assembly and the Senate passed it.
They did.
So,
Over-
I mean, I know a couple of our guys were the ones who voted against it. It was like a handful of maybe 8 Assembly members who
Yeah.
voted against the alienation.
Yes.
So they passed that they could alienate it, and now you're saying
The governor still had to
the
sign.
governor, okay,
And he signed, but with a proviso.
all right. So if the governor doesn't sign it, what happens to what they call it the wall, I understand, that tall building? What happens to the building? Can it not be so tall?
Well, I think that if he decides that that is parkland and that it cannot be, then they don't have the air rights to build that tower. They have to go back to the drawing board. Something certainly can be built because there are plenty of air rights. Oh, this is the last slide. We talked about context. This is 96th Street. Central Park is here. The river is there. Look at the buildings here on Madison Avenue, Park Avenue, Lexington. Look at how much bigger it is. It's totally out of context.
So I just want to say, you
Yeah.
left out the section about the Educational Construction Fund.
Yes.
Which is sort of a city-state hybrid.
Which works with developers.
The sole purpose of them basically is to help developers get these properties.
Yes.
They're building schools, which is a big tax advantage for them, and then they get to go way above the zoning.
Yeah, you're right.
The zoning, and they're doing this all over the city.
Yes,
ECF.
and as a matter of fact, I don't know if I finished that, but they changed the zoning to R10,
Right.
meaning, and then they got bonuses for affordable housing.
Right.
So they were really working with with an FAR of 12 instead of 10, and then with the park getting the same designation and assuming that the alienation went forward, they were able to build this huge tower.
And then they don't pay taxes and we pay their taxes.
There are all sorts of bad things about this, yes. But, so we're keeping our fingers crossed. If it can be shown, demonstrated that this is a park, then the governor will stand by his word and it will. And it's important because there are about 250 of these kinds of jointly operated playgrounds in the city. So it could affect your project too if that decision comes down.
Well, it's not a park issue, but it's.
Oh, okay, it's a different issue.
It's a different,
Yeah.
they want like
Yeah.
3 times.
But
the zoning.
we found that this was the first time that the Educational Construction Fund was alienating a park. It had done other projects elsewhere in the city, but this was the first, and that's why we thought it merited attention. And my last point was, we didn't think it had the proper review in the city because it was just sort of relegated to one council member, and if that council member said yes, then everybody went along. So.
Well, Melissa Mark Viverito pushed that
Oh,
through.
she absolutely did, and you couldn't, everybody was beholden to her because they all need something from her. Yeah, it's, okay.
How can we get, I'm Sheila Kendrick and I live at 10 West 66th Street. And we happen to live next door to this giant tower that's right now marketed as 50 stories and it's gonna be 80 to 100. Our group, Save Central Park NYC, has been working with Sean and Landmark West to try to figure out how to galvanize and get support for not only our issue, but all these issues that have been brought up tonight. How do we get all you people in this room to do letter writing to whatever legislator is or councilperson is involved in a specific issue? How do we stay connected when we leave this room?
So if you signed in and left your email, I can get you copies of all these emails and you can try and contact the people.
That would be wonderful. Would people be open to, because this issue that you're saying about write the governor that we're doing here, say we all got an urgent email and you gave us the link to the governor's site and said, you know, here's what you're gonna say about saving that park. Then we could reiterate in our own words. You know, we don't want, I'm sure nobody wants to be inundated with email, but if we could all kind of restate what you're stating, and then if I send a note out to the same email list and said, this is ridiculous, how can we be being told a building's gonna be 50 stories and it's really gonna be 100 stories and it's gonna cast 1,000-foot shadow on Central Park? Maybe we can all say enough is enough.
Did everybody sign in and leave their email? And Landmark West has a website.
Yeah.
Lowe has a website, and he had his letter on the website, Carnegie Hill Neighbors. And Sierra Club, our group, has a website, so we'll get your information. We'll put it up on the website. But you gotta do it, you know, we're all excited because we're here now, you know, isn't this great? We'll really do something. But tomorrow morning you still have to do it, or next week when we get it up on the website. But you have to do it. You have to do
Can we share
it.
the emails of the people in this room?
If you gave us your email, you're willing to share, right?
Okay.
I mean, I get everybody's emails. I get Landmark West, I get Greenwich, Society for Greenwich Village, I get,
Whatever.
districts, you know, you can sign up for these to be on their websites, and then you'll get their emails, and often they'll have like letters you can automatically sign. So if you sign up like on Landmarks West, you'll get their periodic emails,
even easier.
and, you know, which is easy.
I just want to say,
Human scale. Human scale
yes,
city.
they're very good. They're very good.
So you can proactively go to their websites and sign up to be on their list,
Yeah.
and then
And
you'll
you
get a
know-
lot of
And
notifications.
I'm on a lot of them, but it's about organizing
Yes.
people of like mind that
Can I,
have a
can I answer
passion.
that? Can I answer that? We're all aware that we need more effective ways of working together. But you know, one of the things is we're all sort of staff strapped. I mean, we're all overworked with the issues at hand. And don't you think, Sean, that's one of the...
Understatement.
Yes, so, but we're aware, and we may need to, you know, we may need to create a body that does nothing but coordinate and communicate. I
Well,
mean...
human scale does that.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, human scale may be a good vehicle for that. We all, hello?
So what's the website for Human Scale?
Is it New Yorkers for you?
Yeah,
Yeah, you'll get it.
New York is for a human
New
scale
York is-
city, I think.
For human scale. Yes. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so it's a work, I would say this, it's a work in progress. It will get better because we're all doing things. For example, Carnegie Hill Neighbors in the lawsuit, we're working with Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts. And so more and more groups are realizing you gotta work together, you share.
About the city council, for example, I went to
Stand
a
up.
hall where Ben Callos kept saying over and over, I don't take money from developers. And when I called his office after the vote for the redevelopment around Grand Central, and they didn't get back to me, I called again. How did Mr. Callos vote? Because I heard it was unanimous. He said, well, he gave his vote to Mr. Gorodnick in whose district the Grand Central falls. I mean, it's only 2 blocks away, it's a very contiguous district. And he felt that he knew better about it. Now, Fred knows what's going to happen around Grand Central. He doesn't have to, but this is what they do, they trade their votes.
Religious institutions to see if they want to, what can be done as, instead of separate organizations and synagogues and churches, can they coalesce together and become some kind of a force?
They want the money. Okay, let's let Sean answer.
Yeah.
I was just going to make a point that the real estate board is already 10 steps ahead of anything we're doing. And they've already created a group called Landrex. So it's an organization that has its own lobbying power to get the Catholic Church, St. Patrick's, to have a broader range of where they could disperse their air rights to. Because right around St. Patrick's, you've got Saks Fifth, you've got Rock Center. There's not a lot of places for them to move their air rights. So what Landrex is
You have to let him talk. You must let him talk.
Just letting you know that the.
Well, I think he knows.
A whole new district.
So what Landrec's working with the nonprofits is attempting to do is to broaden the scope of where they can pass their air rights to. So they're just only, the trajectory is to make it easier and easier for them to transfer their development.
Have air rights always been in existence?
No.
It's from 61.
No,
Penn Central.
61.
Penn Central paid, pretty much.
Because that's such a sham, the whole idea that you own the air above your building and can transfer them to somebody else who can now build another.
Because the air is just about their building.
I mean, that the building, that building owns the air above space is crazy.
The TDR idea was sort of developed based on trying to avoid a claim of unconstitutional taking. And the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution that applies to the states through the 14th Amendment says that private property cannot be taken without just compensation. Now, the courts have decided that zoning is not an unconstitutional taking. However, the Supreme Court in Penn Central wanted to approve landmarking for Penn Central, so that Grand Central Station, so that it would not be destroyed. And in that context, they use this concept of transferable development rights. It has gone far beyond anything, I think, that the court ever thought would happen. We now have transferable development rights from the middle of the Hudson River.
Right.
I call it the new miracle. It used to be water to wine, now it's water to real estate.
Right, you're right.
So that's where it began. There are other places where they use these kinds of rights in rural areas when they try to keep pasture land and that kind of thing. But New York City is, I think, and George, you can tell me if I'm wrong, the capital of transferable development rights. And the city allows abuse of that process and is now determining that rather than taxing corporations, rather than taxing Wall Street, rather than doing all of those things, they're going to now sell transfer development rights from, for example, the Hudson River or parks or whatever,
The piers.
and then they will use that to do things that they used to use taxes to do. And why don't they have a lot of taxes? And I know I'm going long on this. Why don't they have a lot of taxes? Because they grant tax abatements to 100-story buildings so that billionaires can use through-floor apartments and they don't pay taxes for 25 or 30 years.
Right.
So that's the core of your problem. The problem is, in this city, you might say it was the mayor's office, but it really is, with all due respect to my friends in the Democratic Party, they pick the mayor, and they generally pick the city council. As terrible as the Republicans are, and I'm trying to be balanced here, the Democrats have the power. So the people who have the power are the people who cause whatever you don't like. And so you need to go to the base.
Last fall is when it happened, okay?
This what?
The city council voted to allow the existing piers to be treated as property that can have air rights.
Yeah.
Okay,
And the
up
state,
to that
the
point,
state enabled that
there,
too
it
by
was not,
passing a statute.
water rights were never considered as part of the air rights, okay? Water didn't have air rights, okay? But just last November, I think it was, that the city council voted to give it to air rights.
Contextual height limits, they're pretty solid, right? If you have a 75-foot height limit, you have to go get a variance to exceed it. You can transfer all the floor area you want. You can't go over 75.
Expanded to like.
Yes, and so therefore, if you wanted to expand it, it could be. I will say that
this administration has absolutely no interest in doing that. So it's one of those things that would have to be done through, through a very strong political effort. I mean, there's a belief that if you build more and higher, then ultimately it's a supply issue, and then ultimately, magically, housing will become more affordable, which, it's a philosophy. I don't necessarily agree with it. Some people have.
Using all these things as taxes, buying them up, and you.
I'm just repeating what I've heard other people say.
Don't kill the messenger.
So my question in terms of what we can do, I mean, Sean also, is that something we could add?
We can get city planning to revisit the 1961 zoning. That's just a base. We can get city planning to do its job. Like, quite simply. And they're not motivated to do that.
Why aren't they motivated to do that? Let's motivate them.
Well, it's the same question whenever you open up anything. We looked at other ways to limit density, and right now there's a multiple dwelling law in New York, and it's capped at 12.
Yes.
And the state would like to increase that. And that's only gonna affect New York City. It's not gonna affect Buffalo. Like, it'll be, theoretically, you could do it in Buffalo.
What do you mean?
Nobody's gonna build in Buffalo. It's only gonna affect New York City and New York City density. And so there's a danger anytime you open up the multiple dwelling law or start to work around city planning if city planning doesn't want to do it. And there's a lot more Republicans in Albany, so we have fear for why we'd want to kick that hornet's nest. So right now, we have to ask city planning. We need to, we're building our portfolio of problems in many ways. Each time that one of these comes up, we're trying to fight precedent being set. On 200 Amsterdam, if this goes through, we're basically saying it's A-okay to reconfigure a master plan super block site and build a tower in a non-tower district, right? We're saying it's okay to count another development's accessory use as your rear yard. We're saying it's okay to violate the sky exposure plane. We're saying it's okay to gerrymander a lot and slice things up. We're saying it's okay to take a covenant on a land that was gifted by Alcoa for community facility use and put a luxury residential unit on it in land that was taken from a lower income use intended for middle income. There's, your whole laundry list of what? On 66th Street, if this goes forward, we're saying it's A-okay for a developer to file for a small building, slowly, with a straw or a vacuum, however you want to, what metaphor you want to use, soak up all the other available FAR and air rights on the block, and then suddenly, presto changeo, I've got them all. I'm going 10 times as large because secretly I've been building a ridiculous foundation all along, and I'm ready to build. And that's the window when the community has time to challenge. And now that the foundations are done, I've spent my money, you gotta let me keep going. So each case, the developers are trying another angle, and there's so many of them all at once. Extel is building so many things in the city right now. On 96th Street and Broadway, which is a great development site, I gotta say, it's a Gristiti site. It's a 1-story high building. No, only its mother could love. It's right next to express and local trains. It's on a wide street on an avenue. If you're gonna put development, that's the appropriate place, and it's contextually zoned, so we know there's a limit. But we also know that the developer is buying up air rights from the neighboring buildings. So if you already have a height limit, why are you buying more air rights? And the answer is, you can transfer air rights or affordable housing within a district, and it's our understanding that the developer of 66th Street is gonna build luxury there, build a luxury building, and build a poor building. So instead of having a rich door, poor door, he's gonna do a rich building, poor building. And the city's not gonna ever say no to a 1 square inch of affordable housing. So if you wanna build more than zoning, even though you're already making money and profit off of affordable housing, we'll let you build as much as you want. So ultimately, a case like that comes down to the city council member. And it's gonna be hard for you to find a city council member that's gonna say no to affordable housing in their district. And this is the game that's being played. It's the war that's being waged. And nobody's against affordable housing.
Yeah, but the number of affordable apartments are so small, there's a lottery. There's thousands of people vying for that affordable.
Well, it's worse than that, right?
They get a tax abatement for that.
Well, if you looked at all those black spots I showed on Broadway, a lot of those are existing housing. A lot of that has been there for 80 to 100 years. A lot of those are stabilized. But if you tear down the building, you don't have to deal with stabilization laws anymore. So it's worth their interest to buy out a building that's maybe 4 or 6 stories tall, tear it down, and now I can build not only the 10 before, but I can build 2 more and build 12. And then only those 2 are affordable for maybe, depending on the rules, either in perpetuity or up to 30 years. So, and you're still making it at a different rate of affordability.
Right.
It's always in that interest. So the city's incentivizing the displacement of affordable units.
People need to be educated about that.
Right, so we do talks at night.
Check the websites.
Sign up for
of
the newsletter.
people
If
who
you
are
just hit
here.
landmarkwest.org, you get a little guy by R.O. Blackman that pops up inviting you to join our mailing list. So just do that.
Okay, I'd like to thank the speakers, everybody. Let's give them a round of applause.